"Don't wear that," the voice on the phone said flatly. "Dress properly, or don't come at all." Then the line went dead, leaving only the faint hiss of silence, the kind that settles after a door slams in your face. I stayed there, the receiver pressed against my ear long after I realized no one was on the other end. It wasn't just what they said, it was how they said it. No hesitation, no softening. As if I were a problem to be managed. As if I were an embarrassment that could be fixed with the right jacket and tie. Dress properly. The words felt like they'd been hammered into me. 4 cold nails meant to pin me into a shape that wasn't mine. 3 days later, the envelope came. Heavy cream paper, smooth under my fingers, with a gold-embossed edge that caught the light like something too polished to touch. My name was written in neat, formal script, the kind that tries to look personal, but isn't. I slid it open carefully, not because I was afraid to tear it, but because I already knew whatever was inside wasn't meant to feel warm. It was my daughter's wedding invitation. The date, the place, the time, that was all. No dear dad, no "we're so happy you're coming," no private note to say she wanted me there for more than just the pictures. At the bottom, printed in the same clean, detached font as the rest, were 2 words. 2 words that had already been spoken into my ear, now burned into paper. Dress properly. I sat at the kitchen table and read it again, and again. The letters blurred, but not because my eyes were failing me. They blurred because I was remembering. I remembered standing in the heat of a desert that smelled of dust and diesel, wearing the uniform they were now politely telling me not to wear. I remembered sleeping in a ditch with rainwater seeping into my boots, holding a letter from home that had been read so many times the ink was smudged. I remembered the day I came back, stepping onto home soil with the same uniform on my back, believing it meant something permanent. Now, here I was, decades later, holding a piece of paper that told me my service, my history, wasn't proper enough for my own daughter's wedding. Not for her, not for the people she was marrying into, not for the photographs that would hang on their walls. They didn't want the man who had fought for his country. They wanted a version of him that fit their table arrangements. I didn't tear the invitation. I didn't call to refuse. I just laid it in the center of the table, where the afternoon sun hit it like a spotlight. Every time I walked past, it looked back at me, daring me to decide who I would be that day, the man they wanted, or the man I was. And as the days inched forward, as the calendar moved closer to the wedding, a thought began to rise in me like a tide that couldn't be held back. If they were going to measure me by what I wore, then I was going to make sure I gave them something they would never forget. Friends, let's take a short pause. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? Has anything like this ever happened to you? If you're feeling the weight of this story, please subscribe and share this video. It's how you help us grow this channel and bring more stories to life. All right, let's continue. It wasn't really about clothes. Clothes were just the surface, the polite disguise for something sharper, colder. Beneath those 2 words, dress properly, was a whole other sentence they didn't dare put on paper. Be someone else. Hide the parts of you we don't want them to see. They weren't asking for elegance. They were asking for erasure. I knew the kind of guest they wanted me to be. The man who sat quietly in the back, smiled in the photographs, said nothing that might unsettle the fragile image they were curating for their new in-laws. A man polished smooth, stripped of all the edges that told the truth about where he'd been. They didn't want the father who came home with sand still in his pockets. They didn't want the soldier whose eyes had learned to search every room before sitting down. They wanted a prop, a shape, a shadow. It stung more because I had played that role before, years earlier. I had sat in their living rooms and swallowed my stories whole, letting them die in my throat, because I thought silence was the price of peace. But the thing about erasing someone is, if you do it long enough, they start to wonder if maybe you really are better off gone. And I could feel it, the quiet exclusion that doesn't announce itself with slammed doors or shouted insults, but with 1,000 little absences. No invitation to speak, no mention of who I was before I was just dad. The irony was almost cruel. The same hands that once sent me off with prayers and flags now wanted me back, but smaller, safer, proper, as if all those years of service could be pressed into a dark suit and hidden behind a polite smile, as if dignity could be separated from the life that earned it. I thought about the years between then and now, the nights I had sat in the dark, boots by the door, unable to sleep unless every light was off, every lock checked twice. I thought about the letters I had never answered because I didn't want them to hear what was really in my head. I thought about the promises I had kept, not because they were easy, but because they were all I had left to hold on to. And now they were asking me, without saying it out loud, to trade all of that in for the comfort of strangers, to stand still while they cut pieces off me until I fit the shape they needed for one afternoon in front of a camera. It wasn't the kind of wound that bleeds. It was the kind that seeps in quietly and tells you you were enough once, but not anymore. I sat with that for a long time, and the longer I sat, the more I knew. If I gave them what they wanted, I'd be proving them right. If I showed up as anything less than myself, I wouldn't just be agreeing to their rules. I'd be letting them decide which parts of me deserved to exist, and that was never going to happen. I opened the old wardrobe slowly, the hinges groaning as if they too remembered how many years had passed. Inside, the suits hung in their perfect row, dark, polite, and utterly forgettable. They were the kind of clothes that made you blend into a crowd, that let you disappear without a trace. Some had been worn to christenings, others to funerals, most to events where my presence was wanted only because it was quiet. They smelled faintly of cedar and stillness, like they had been waiting for a man I had never truly been. But my eyes didn't linger on them. They went straight to the far corner, to the garment bag that time had thinned and faded. Its zipper was a little stiff, the fabric worn smooth in the places my hands had gripped it over the years when I'd pushed it aside to reach for something else. I unzipped it slowly, almost reverently, and the faint scent of it drifted out. Not the dust of disuse, but something deeper. The sharpness of starch, the ghost of desert wind, the echo of days that had demanded every ounce of strength I had. Inside was the uniform I had folded away the day I came home from war. The creases still held, even after all these years, as if the fabric refused to forget the weight of the body that had worn it. The jacket was heavy in my hands, and for a moment I didn't just see it, I felt it. The way it had clung to me under the heat of the sun, the way the collar had rubbed against my neck during long marches, the way it had carried my sweat, my fear, my stubborn will to make it to the next dawn. I traced the patches with my fingertips, each stitch holding more than just thread. This wasn't decoration. It was history. The stripes, the insignia, the medals, they weren't shiny trinkets for display. They were proof that I had stood where others fell, proof that I had carried the weight when someone had to, proof that I had given pieces of myself I could never take back. For years I had kept it hidden, not because I was ashamed, but because I thought I'd earned the right to live quietly, without the constant reminder of where I'd been. But as I held it now, I realized it had never stopped being part of me. It was the one thing in that closet that wasn't trying to make me smaller, that didn't ask me to pretend. I thought of the wedding, of the eyes that would watch me walk in, of the whispers that might follow. And instead of dread, I felt something else rising in me, something steadier. This uniform wasn't just clothing. It was the truest version of proper I would ever own. And if they couldn't see that, it wasn't me who was out of place. It was them. The jacket rested across my arms, heavier than it should have been. Not because of the fabric itself, but because of everything it carried. This wasn't just cloth. It was a map of places that no longer existed the way I remembered them. Woven into its threads was the dust from streets where children waved at convoys without understanding the danger, where markets bustled one day and lay silent the next. The cuffs still held faint, invisible traces of the rain that had fallen on nights when I'd lain awake in a ditch, watching the horizon for movement that might mean we wouldn't see morning. There were stains only I could see, not of blood or mud, but of moments, the kind that change you without leaving a mark. A cry cut short, a letter never sent, a joke told under fire just to remind ourselves we were still alive. The fabric remembered those things. It held them in its silence. And as I ran my hands down the sleeves, I could almost hear them again. The low murmur of voices in the dark, the calls over the radio, the last words of men who never made it back. Every seam was stitched with respect. Not the kind you demand, but the kind you earn in the eyes of those who have seen you at your weakest and trusted you to stand anyway. The patches on the shoulders weren't decoration. They were promises I had kept, oaths I had lived by, even when it would have been easier to walk away. The medals pinned to the chest weren't just symbols. They were stories compressed into metal, each one a sentence that could never be fully explained to someone who hadn't been there. I thought about how this jacket had once been part of my skin, how it had shaped the way I moved, how it had given me both weight and purpose. And now, years later, it felt like holding a mirror that showed me not just who I was then, but who I still was, beneath the gray in my hair, beneath the quiet years, beneath the distance that had grown between me and the people who should have known me best. I knew what they would see when I walked in wearing it. Not the dust, not the rain, not the voices, just a man in an old uniform, maybe a little out of place. But I also knew what I would feel, the presence of everyone who had once stood beside me. And for one day, in that room where I was meant to shrink, I would carry them with me. Because if I was going to be remembered for anything at that wedding, it wasn't going to be for blending in. It was going to be for standing exactly as I was, wearing the weight of my life in every seam. I held the uniform against my chest, the fabric cool at first, then warming as if it recognized me. My heartbeat slowed, falling into the steady rhythm it used to find in the moments before stepping into something I couldn't turn back from. This wasn't nostalgia. This was clarity. Every crease, every patch, every dull shine of the metal told me exactly who I was, and reminded me that I didn't owe anyone a version of myself polished to fit their comfort. If they wanted me proper, they would get the most proper version of me that had ever existed. Not the quiet man in the dark suit, not the easy guest who sat in the back and smiled when cued. They would get the man who had earned every stripe on his sleeve with days that bled into nights, who had carried men out of places where no one should have to go, who had stood at attention under skies heavy with both sun and sorrow. They would get the truth, and the truth didn't need permission to walk through that door. I thought of the wedding, the rows of white chairs, the flowers arranged to perfection, the photographs that would be framed for decades. And somewhere in those pictures there I would be, not as a background figure, but as the man in the uniform, the one no one could mistake for anything else. Let them whisper if they wanted to. Let them look uncomfortable. If a piece of fabric could hold the weight of years, it could certainly hold a room's uneasy silence. There was a time when I might have compromised, when I might have told myself it wasn't worth the fight. But that was before I realized that some battles aren't about winning. They're about refusing to lose yourself. If I gave up this, I'd be agreeing that my history, my sacrifices, my very identity could be folded away as easily as this uniform had been in the back of my closet. I laid it out on the bed, smoothing the fabric with both hands, and for the first time in years, I felt taller. Not proud in the shallow sense, but anchored, solid. The decision wasn't about defiance. It was about respect. Respect for where I'd been, for the people who hadn't come back, for the man I still was when the medals stopped clinking and the applause faded. When I stepped into that wedding, it wouldn't just be me walking in. It would be every memory, every sacrifice, every unspoken truth stitched into these seams. And no one, not even family, had the right to tell me that wasn't proper. The car rolled to a slow stop at the edge of the long stone drive, tires crunching over the gravel before the engine sighed into silence. For a few moments I didn't move. My hand rested on the door handle, fingers curling around the cool metal, the other hand smoothing the fabric of my jacket almost without thinking. The weight of the uniform pressed into my shoulders, not as a burden, but as a steadying force, a reminder that I had faced bigger moments than this and walked through them standing tall. Through the closed door, I could hear the life of the celebration spilling outward, a soft wash of voices, rising and falling in warm bursts, laughter that seemed to ring brighter than the afternoon sun, the light chatter of champagne glasses meeting in polite toasts. It was the sound of a world I used to belong to without question, back before years of silence had pushed me to the margins. Today, I wasn't walking in as a shadow. I was walking in as myself, whether they wanted that or not. I pushed the door open and stepped out, the motion slow, deliberate. The sunlight hit the crisp lines of my jacket, catching the pressed edges and glinting off the polished metal of the medals pinned to my chest. The faint, unmistakable clink of them broke through the easy rhythm of the courtyard. Heads began to turn. Conversation snagged on unfinished words. Even the laughter faltered, hanging in the air like a balloon that had slipped from someone's hand. It wasn't the kind of attention that shouted. It was quieter, heavier. Eyes darted from one detail to another, the insignia on my shoulders, the ribbons, the shine of my shoes, the tilt of my chin. Some expression softened into something like respect. Others tightened with discomfort, as if my presence had just shifted the temperature of the day. I could almost hear the thoughts behind the stares. Why is he wearing that? Did she know he would come like this? What's the story? The courtyard smelled faintly of flowers and polished wood, but beneath that I caught the scent of something older, dust and sunlight, the phantom memory of open skies. With each step toward the entrance, my shoes struck the stone with a measured rhythm, a sound that seemed louder in the growing hush. I wasn't hurrying. This wasn't a race to join the crowd. This was a return, step by step, on my own terms. By the time I reached the archway, the string quartet inside had softened to a low, uncertain hum, the notes spilling into the open air but somehow quieter, as if even the music understood it was no longer the main event. No one had spoken to me yet, but they didn't need to. The pause in the air told me everything. My arrival had interrupted something fragile, and they didn't know whether to resent it or to honor it, and that was fine. I hadn't come for their comfort. I had come for the truth, and without a single word, I could feel it filling the room ahead of me. The uniform was speaking already, in a voice older than this place, older than any table setting or flower arrangement. I simply kept walking, letting it speak for both of us. She was standing near the far end of the courtyard when she saw me. I caught the moment her eyes found mine, the smile she'd been wearing mid-laugh freezing in place, as if someone had pressed pause. For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Then her gaze broke from my face and began a slow, deliberate journey downward, over the medals, the stripes, the pressed lines of the jacket, the polished shoes, before coming back up again. It wasn't a casual glance. It was an inventory. Her expression shifted in ways only a father would notice. First, surprise. Real, unguarded, almost childlike. Then something harder to name. A flicker of embarrassment. A calculation of what others might think. A search for the right reaction when the script she'd prepared no longer fit the moment. Her bouquet dipped slightly in her hands, petals trembling as though they too sensed the sudden change in the air. I could feel the eyes around her turning toward me as well, drawn not by her movements but by the sharp absence of whatever she'd been saying. The groom's family stood a little apart, dressed in their immaculate suits, fabrics cut with the precision of money. Their jackets were slim, their ties perfectly knotted, every thread saying, "We belong in photographs." And yet, as their gazes slid over me, something in their posture faltered. It wasn't outright respect, not yet, but their own finery seemed suddenly smaller, less certain. The whispers began in the spaces between footsteps and music. Low, quick words traded just behind cupped hands. Not cruel, but curious. Not loud, but impossible to ignore. It was the sound of people trying to place a man they didn't expect to see, in a uniform they didn't expect to confront. I didn't need to hear the exact words. I'd been in enough rooms to know their shape. Who is he? Why is he wearing that? Did she know? My daughter's eyes darted briefly toward her fiancé, searching for what? Approval? Reassurance? Permission? His gaze stayed on me, steady but unreadable, the kind of look men give when they're deciding how much of a challenge they're willing to take on. I didn't break eye contact. I didn't nod or smile. I simply stood there, the late afternoon sun warming the dark fabric across my shoulders, letting the silence between us stretch until it was the loudest thing in the courtyard. In that pause, I saw it. The faintest shift in her expression. Not joy, not relief, but recognition. For the first time in years, she was seeing me not as the quiet man she could edit out of the story, but as the man whose life could never be reduced to a line in a family speech. She looked away first, but the weight of that glance stayed between us, as real and unshakable as the uniform itself. The sound started like the faint stir of leaves in a still garden, small, restless, almost easy to miss. But then it grew, not in volume, but in weight, weaving through the courtyard until it became the quiet undertone beneath every breath. The ripple of voices moved from one small cluster to another, carried by glances that darted my way and then quickly away again. It was never just one voice at a time. It was the layering of them, the way each whispered fragment overlapped and fed into the next. "Is that from somewhere near the drinks table?" A hushed, "He served?" from a pair of older guests leaning in toward each other. And then, more cutting because of its confusion, "Why didn't she ever say?" That last question lingered not just in the air, but inside me. Why didn't she? For years, my service had been something I kept in a quiet place, partly because it was mine, partly because I thought those who needed to know already did. I had never worn it like a badge to be flashed for approval. I had no appetite for the shallow applause that comes without understanding. But hearing those whispers now, I realized something. The absence of my story hadn't been accidental. It had been erased. My daughter had built a version of me that fit her life, her circles, her curated introductions. And in that version, the man in the uniform didn't exist. Now, in one unplanned moment, all of that careful editing had been undone. The truth hung between the flower arrangements and polished wine glasses, visible, undeniable, and there was no folding it away, no pushing it back into the dark. The uniform was speaking for me louder than any toast could. Every thread, every metal, every seam announced a history that could not be ignored. I could see it in their faces, how the weight of it unsettled them. Some stood straighter out of respect they didn't know how to express. Others shifted uncomfortably, as if the sight of me called into question the very definition of proper they had accepted without thinking. And in that unsettled air, I felt something else taking root, a quiet, immovable sense of presence. I was no longer the shadow at the edge of the photographs. I was the center of a truth that had finally stepped into the light. The whispers didn't stop. They moved and multiplied, chasing each other in loops around the courtyard, but I let them run their course. I had lived through louder things than gossip, and I knew what they hadn't yet learned. Words spoken in hushed tones have a way of becoming the only thing anyone remembers, and by the end of this day, whether they liked it or not, they would remember me. The music swelled inside, gentle and polished, the kind chosen to keep emotions in check rather than set them free. Guests were already in their seats, a soft murmur rippling through the room like the last breath before a performance begins. I stood at the threshold for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the softer light. The aisle stretched out ahead of me, framed by flowers and white ribbons, perfect in its symmetry. It was the kind of scene designed for beauty, not truth. I could have taken a seat in the back, far from the center, slipping into the shadows where no one would notice if I was there or not. It would have been easier, expected, but that was the role they had always hoped I'd play. Quiet, distant, present only as a formality, and I was done with that. I stepped forward, the sound of my cane tapping against the stone floor marking a steady, deliberate rhythm. The metals on my chest swayed with each movement, catching the light in brief flashes, each glint a reminder of something no one here had seen but all could feel. Conversations hushed as I moved, heads turning not out of idle curiosity, but out of a need to follow the presence that had just entered the room. The aisle was long, but I didn't rush. Every step was its own declaration. a silent answer to years of being quietly set aside. My shoes pressed into the runner, the faint give beneath me contrasting with the hard weight of history I carried on my shoulders. The scent of fresh flowers mingled with the distant tang of polished metal from the metals that had spent more time in the dark than in the light. As I walked, I passed faces frozen mid-expression, some softened, some uncertain, some almost guilty. My daughter stood at the far end, her eyes locked on me, bouquet trembling slightly in her hands. Behind her, the groom's family shifted in their places, their earlier confidence now dimmed by the gravity of my approach. This wasn't about making a scene. It wasn't about defiance. It was about presence. About standing in the space that was mine by right, not by invitation. Each step said without words, I earned my place here. Not through money, not through social polish, but through nights without sleep. Through years that took more than they gave. Through a life lived with a weight most here had never felt. By the time I reached the front, the music had softened to a whisper. I took my seat not at the edges, but near the heart of the gathering, where I could see everything and be seen. I didn't lower my eyes. I didn't shrink. And in that stillness, I knew. The walk had already said everything that needed to be said. The officiant stood at the front, hands folded loosely over a small leather book, his voice just beginning to rise in that careful ceremonial tone. But then he stopped. It wasn't a stumble or a loss of place. It was deliberate. His gaze swept over the guests, lingering for a moment here and there, before it found me. And when it did, something shifted in his expression, as if a thought had landed and refused to be brushed aside. For a heartbeat, the room was utterly still. Then he closed the book, only slightly, and spoke words I knew he hadn't written in his notes. "Before we begin," he said, his voice steady but carrying an edge of emotion that drew everyone's attention, "I think we should acknowledge the man who wore this uniform for all of us." The air seemed to thicken around the words. They weren't just about me. They were about what the uniform represented, about the people who weren't in the room to hear it. For a moment it was as though the flowers, the music, even the perfect symmetry of the chairs faded into the background, and the weight of a different kind of ceremony took its place. The applause began softly, a handful of hands meeting in a gentle rhythm, almost hesitant, as though the guests were testing the space, unsure how loud to be. But then it grew, not in speed, but in depth. It was no longer the light, polite clapping that fills the gaps between speeches at weddings. It was heavier, slower, each strike of palm against palm carrying the weight of recognition, of something long overdue. I sat there, the sound washing over me, my cane resting upright against my leg, my hands folded across my lap. I didn't bow my head or raise my hand to wave. I simply held their gaze, letting the applause meet me without deflecting it. In the faces turned toward me, I saw different things, respect in some, regret in others, a dawning awareness in many that there was a story in this room far older and harder than the one written in the day's program. Across the aisle I caught my daughter's eyes. She didn't smile, not exactly, but her lips pressed together as if she were holding back something. Maybe pride, maybe guilt, maybe both. The groom's family clapped too, though their hands moved in a more measured way, as if they were still trying to decide what this moment meant for them. When the applause finally faded, the officiant gave me a small nod before opening his book again, and in that nod I understood that my presence here had already shifted the shape of the day. Before a single vow had been spoken, before the first toast had been poured, the truth I carried on my shoulders had been acknowledged, not hidden, not diminished. It wasn't the kind of speech you rehearse. It wasn't one I'd expected. But in its unplanned simplicity, it said more than any prepared words could have. And for the first time in years, I felt like the room saw me, truly saw me, without asking me to be anyone else. She stood only a few steps from the officiant, the bouquet in her hands trembling just enough for the petals to catch the light with each movement. Her smile, which had been so carefully arranged for the photographs, began to falter, not collapse, not vanish entirely, but soften in a way that betrayed the effort it had taken to hold it in place. Then her gaze shifted, and for a moment she met my eyes. It wasn't a long look. It was brief, almost stolen, but it was enough for me to see the change. Her lashes lowered, and she looked down as if the weight of something unseen had suddenly landed on her shoulders. The flowers tilted in her hands, and a single tear broke free, tracing a slow path down her cheek. I didn't know if it was pride. It could have been, a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement of the man she had been trying to keep in the shadows, now brought into the light before everyone. Or maybe it was guilt, sharp and sudden for the years when my service, my life before fatherhood, had been reduced to a silence we both pretended was natural. Perhaps it was both, pride tangled with guilt, in a way that made it impossible to separate one from the other. The guests closest to her noticed, though they tried not to stare. One of the bridesmaids reached as if to brush the tear away, but my daughter shook her head slightly, keeping her eyes down. She wasn't hiding the tear. She was letting it be seen, though I wasn't sure for whose sake. I sat in my chair, the weight of the uniform pressing into me, and felt a shift I couldn't quite name. It wasn't victory. It wasn't vindication. It was something more fragile, like the first crack in ice that's been holding too long. That tear, small as it was, told me she had felt something in that moment that no instruction, no carefully worded invitation could control. And as the officiant's voice rose again, guiding the ceremony forward, I realized that for all the speeches and vows still to come, it was that single tear, silent, unannounced, that might end up being the truest moment of the day. Somewhere between the vows and the music, the room shifted. It was subtle at first, an almost imperceptible loosening of the grip that formality had on everyone. The chatter between guests grew quieter, not because they were tired, but because the carefully curated details of the day were losing their power. The designer dresses, once the centerpiece of admiration, were now just fabric and thread. No one leaned in to whisper about the cut of a suit or the shimmer of a gown. The brand names, the price tags, the meticulously chosen colors, they had all begun to fade into the background. What lingered instead was something far heavier, far simpler. It was me, or rather, the fact of me, sitting there in the uniform they hadn't planned for, hadn't wanted, but could no longer ignore. The quiet man in the front row, the one who had been absent in the stories, absent in the introductions, suddenly existing in a way that no one could edit out. I could feel it in their eyes, a shift from polite recognition to something deeper, something closer to reckoning. It wasn't the uniform alone, it was what it carried, the memory of those not here to see this day, the proof of years spent in places that stripped a man down to his barest self and dared him to keep going. The unspoken reality that the man they had been told was complicated was, in truth, built of something steadier than anything money or comfort could buy. The groom's family, who had arrived draped in quiet pride over their own refinement, seemed less certain now. Their glances carried questions that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Why hadn't we been told? What else don't we know? The guests who had whispered in the courtyard earlier no longer whispered at all. They simply looked, as if staring long enough might piece together the story they had been missing. And my daughter. She kept glancing at me between her lines in the ceremony, as though testing whether I was really there, whether the man she had kept at arm's length could be reconciled with the one now fixed in everyone's sight. I didn't look away when our eyes met. I wanted her to see that I wasn't hiding, that I wasn't about to shrink back into the quiet corner they'd saved for me. By the time the ceremony neared its close, it was no longer just a wedding. It was something else, something truer. The room wasn't thinking about centerpieces or champagne anymore. They were thinking about the story in front of them, the one they hadn't expected to hear, the one that didn't need to be told aloud because it was stitched into every thread I wore. And in that truth, the day belonged to me as much as it did to anyone. By the time the vows were spoken and the applause rolled gently through the room, something in the air had changed. The stiffness that had met me at the beginning, that invisible wall of polite distance, had thinned until it was barely there at all. People no longer slipped their eyes past me as if I were a stranger occupying an unassigned seat. They looked directly now, steady, curious, with a kind of quiet respect that couldn't be manufactured. It began with a man I didn't recognize. He stepped forward as the couple made their way down the aisle, extending his hand without hesitation. His grip was firm, his expression almost solemn. "Thank you," he said, only 2 words, but weighted enough to tell me he wasn't thanking me for attending a wedding. Then another followed, and another. Soon I was standing there, my cane in one hand, my other caught in a slow rhythm of handshakes, each one lingering just a fraction longer than courtesy demanded. Old friends I hadn't seen in years appeared from the crowd, their faces breaking into genuine warmth as they clasped my shoulder, leaning in close, as if to close the distance of time in a single gesture. Their words were brief, names of places we'd once known, nods toward memories too large to fit into conversation here, but their eyes carried the rest. Even her fiancé's father approached, moving with a deliberation that told me he'd been considering this moment for some time. He stood straighter now, his immaculate suit still perfect but no longer the loudest statement on him. He didn't offer small talk. He didn't overreach. He simply looked me in the eye, and in that glance, I could see an acknowledgement, not of status, not of approval, but of standing. 2 men measuring each other and quietly agreeing that no more needed to be said. Around us, the reception began to hum to life. Music lifted in the background, glasses were filled, conversations sparked anew. But the current flowing through it all was different now, warmer. I wasn't on the edge of the room anymore, waiting to be invited in. I was a part of it, not because someone had decided I could be, but because I had stepped in carrying the weight of something they couldn't ignore. It struck me then that the shift wasn't only in them. It was in me, too. I hadn't realized until that moment how long I had been bracing myself for rejection, for dismissal. Standing there, with hands still warm from the press of others, I felt that tension easing out of me, replaced by something steadier. I was no longer here on their terms, I was here on mine, and everyone knew it. She approached slowly, as if each step toward me cost her something she couldn't name. The crowd moved around her in soft blurs, laughter and music weaving in and out, but in my sight there was only her, my daughter, bouquet trembling in her grip, petals loosening one by one, as though the flowers themselves felt the weight of what was coming. When she stopped in front of me, she didn't rush into words. Her eyes traveled over me again, but this time it wasn't the quick, startled scan from earlier. It was slower, deliberate, as if she were memorizing something she had no intention of ever forgetting. Her lips parted once, then closed. I could see her swallow before she spoke, the voice quieter than the music, but more steady than I expected. "Dad, you look perfect." That was all. No apology, no explanation for the phone call, the envelope, the careful omission of who I was from the version of me she'd been showing the world. But in that moment I didn't need her to say, "I'm sorry." It was there in the way her eyes softened, in the way her shoulders lowered just slightly, as if she'd been holding tension for years, and had only now realized she could let it go. I thought about the thousands of miles between the man in this uniform and the little girl I used to carry on my shoulders. I thought about all the years when the silence between us had been filled with everything except the truth. And now, in this one brief exchange, the silence was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full, brimming with something fragile but alive. Acknowledgement. I didn't tell her she was forgiven. I didn't tell her she was wrong. I just let the words settle between us, their meaning stretching beyond the literal, into something bigger. I see you. I see all of you. And I know now what I should have known all along. Her hand brushed against my sleeve as she adjusted the bouquet. A fleeting touch, but enough to make me feel the shift in her. She wasn't just looking at her father. She was seeing the man behind him, the soldier, the survivor, the one she had kept hidden even from herself. Then she smiled, small and real, before stepping back into the crowd. She didn't have to turn around for me to know she was carrying that image with her, and for the first time in a long time, I felt no need to follow her, no need to demand anything more. Some apologies don't arrive as words. They arrive as a look you can't mistake, in a voice that wavers just enough to let the truth through. The reception was still in full swing when I decided it was time to leave. Laughter rose in pockets across the room, silverware chimed against plates, the music drifted easily between songs. I stood slowly, letting the chair scrape softly against the floor, the sound barely noticeable, but enough to mark the moment for myself. I reached for my cane, feeling the polished wood fit naturally into my hand, and with the other I brushed the front of my jacket one last time. The metals shifted with a quiet, deliberate clink, as if they too knew this day had been a test, and we had passed it together. The walk to the door was unhurried. I didn't try to slip away unnoticed. People saw me go, some nodded, some simply followed me with their eyes, but no one looked through me anymore. That was the difference. I could feel it in the air, the shift from polite tolerance to something closer to recognition. Not everyone understood the full weight of what I wore, but they understood enough. When I reached the wide double doors, I paused for a moment, my hand resting on the brass handle. The cool metal under my fingers reminded me of other thresholds I had crossed in my life, some leading into danger, others into silence, all of them demanding a choice about who I would be on the other side. This one was different. There was no fear here, no battle waiting beyond, only the knowledge that I was leaving with more than I had arrived with. I stepped through, and the late afternoon light met me like an old friend. The air was warmer than it had been earlier, carrying the faint scent of cut grass and distant flowers. The sound of the celebration dimmed behind me, muffled by the closing doors, until all that was left was the quiet rhythm of my steps on the stone. I wasn't walking away from them. I was walking toward myself. For years they had tried to keep certain parts of me in the dark, not out of cruelty, perhaps, but out of a belief that those parts didn't fit, didn't belong in the picture they wanted to frame. But today had proven something unshakable. Dignity doesn't fade just because it's been hidden. It waits. And when the moment comes, it steps into the light without asking for permission. As the doors settled shut behind me, I felt taller, not in posture, but in presence. My uniform felt lighter now, not because it had shed its weight, but because I no longer carried it alone. The truth it represented had been seen, and once seen, it could not be unseen. I didn't need a speech. I didn't need an apology. I didn't even need their understanding. Sometimes the best way to answer an insult isn't with anger or argument. It's by standing in the truth so firmly that it leaves no room for doubt. And as I made my way down the long drive toward the waiting car, the cane steady in my hand, I knew they would remember this. Not because I demanded it, but because the sight of a man unashamed to be exactly who he is something no one forgets.